Despite the complete dismissal of any link between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden more than 3 years after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Mr. Bush's references to al-Qaeda seem to be, if anything, occurring with even greater frequency within his comments about that conflict. At last Thursday's news conference, the president having made 20 specific references to al-Qaeda while speaking about Iraq.
What's realistic as well is to understand the consequences of what will happen if we fail in Iraq. In other words, people aren't just going to be content with driving America out of Iraq. Al-Qaeda wants to hurt us here. That's their objective. That's what they'd like to do. The same folks that are bombing innocent people in Iraq were the ones who attacked us in America on September the 11th. And that's why what happens in Iraq matters to the security here at home.
Here we go again. Time now to call in MSNBC terrorism analyst Roger Cressy, counterterrorism coordinator of the National Security Council staff until September of 2003. Roger, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
This is a conversation we've had so many times before we could probably just act it out in mime. But
yes.
So long as the White House keeps making these claims, I guess we're going to have to keep knocking this down. Let's start here with this equation. Al-Qaeda, the terrorist who attacked us on 9/11, was in all the papers, to this organization that calls itself Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Is that an honest, parallel connection merging to make?
No, it's completely misleading. The organization that attacked us in 9/11 is still trying to attack us. That is the group that is primarily on the Afghan-Pakistan border that you've seen all the intelligence community assessments about in the past few days. The group inside Iraq is very indigenous. It's a function of what happened in Iraq after Saddam was overthrown. In effect, we've actually helped create the conditions that allowed al-Qaeda to take root in Iraq. It's clear that al-Qaeda in Iraq has ideological sympathies with al-Qaeda Central, that clearly there's been some communication between the two, but it is false and misleading for the president to make that direct linkage the way he did.
And part and parcel with that direct linkage, this claim that if the U.S. forces leave Iraq, al-Qaeda would use Iraq as this base to launch attacks against targets conceivably here in the United States. Is that something al-Qaeda in Iraq would even be capable of doing?
You know, Keith, regardless of what happens in Iraq, let's say for a moment Iraq magically turns into a stable democracy, al-Qaeda, the organization, is still going to try and attack us inside the United States. In that respect, the two are not linked. Now, if somehow al-Qaeda in Iraq is allowed to assume supremacy in that country, then certainly they're going to look at a strategy of regional instability, of overthrowing the other governments in the region, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, etc. And ultimately, they could project power elsewhere in the Middle East and maybe even Europe. But the central threat we face inside the United States is not from the jihadi presence in Iraq. It's from al-Qaeda, the organization.
And the central threat in Iraq, to listen to Mr. Bush, you would think, is solely al-Qaeda in Iraq, as if that's the only enemy that we are facing there, or the Iraqis who don't want violence are facing there. Does not al-Qaeda in Iraq account for merely a small percentage of the attacks on U.S. forces just in that country?
And that's the intelligence community's assessment. When you look at the director of the CIA, Michael Hayden, and other senior intelligence officials, they say al-Qaeda is one component of the problem that we face. It's basic sectarian violence of Shia on Sunni, it's criminal activity in organizations, and it's Iran. So if al-Qaeda magically disappeared inside Iraq, you would still have major threats to U.S. forces, a major challenge to security and stability. It's one component of the problem, Keith, but it's not the only component. And the false assumption the president makes about that, frankly, prevents the type of national consensus we need in the United States to deal with the real al-Qaeda threat.
Well, lastly, Roger, give us a preview. What are we expecting to learn out of the release this week of the National Intelligence Estimate?
I think you're going to see some of the same themes that were previewed in last week's reports, that al-Qaeda, the organization, has reconstituted itself, that Iraq serves as a recruiting tool for al-Qaeda on a global basis because of what we see going on in Iraq in terms of the images and the successes, unfortunately, that the jihadis have had against U.S. soldiers. It's become a tremendous recruiting tool, an ideological tool, and I think you're going to see trends like that identified in this National Intelligence Assessment, and it's in a very wrong direction.
MSNBC counterterrorism analyst Roger Cressy. Roger, great thanks for your time as always.
All right, Keith, thanks.